I'm a bit sad. I had to give back the R5 and the Sony a7S III, and now I'm just stuck with this poor little EOS R, who was totally fine 2 weeks ago. I had no issues with this camera, and now it doesn't seem as good anymore. Dang it. 2018, I was trying to figure out what camera would be best for my filmmaking, and I was comparing the Sony a7 III and the Canon EOS R. I ended up with the R. 2020, we're comparing the Sony a7S III and the R5. Right now I have both pre-ordered, but I feel like I need to choose one camera system or the other just to make things a little bit more simple and a little bit easier for me in the whole post side of things. And this video is probably more for me than it is for you guys, because I'm really trying to figure out what the best camera would be for me right now. But I do hope that it helps you guys also. But before we get to the comparison, since I've been editing in Final Cut Pro 10 a lot recently, full video on Final Cut Pro 10 versus Premiere Pro coming soon, I got my audio expert friend Ryan Freeman to make me the same audio presets I already had in Premiere now for Final Cut Pro 10. So if you're a Final Cut user and you want super nice full sounding audio done very easy, these are for you. I use these presets all the time because they're just so easy to use. For example, here we have some raw audio. About a year ago, I described my perfect dream. Sounds okay, it's a pretty expensive microphone, but we're gonna add the male indoor voice medium on there. Okay, so here's the raw audio. My perfect dream camera. And now let's add it. Full frame, 4K, up to 120 frames per second, nice dynamic range. Maybe that was too much for you. Let's add the light. Range, good autofocus, good color science, or maybe we want more LCD screen, and maybe throw in some IBIS in there. And now we have the Canon EOS R5. It's literally that easy. You just gotta find whether it's a female or male voice, indoor or outdoor. There's a bunch of different settings. And then we have some mixes for background and Foley, and then also some effects. For example, if you wanna be underwater, some IBIS in there. Underwater, science, a flip LCD telephone, screen, or maybe you want to be a monster. I don't use that one too often, but these are really easy. If you want high quality sounding audio, but you're like me and you don't really understand audio as much as you do video, but you still want it done well, these are so great. Thank you, Ryan Freeman, for making these for me. They're on the store now, just like the Premiere Pro ones, and I just want to say I'm sorry, all you Final Cut users, for neglecting you. I'm trying to be better. Okay, so I had the Sony a7S III and the R5 at the same time for a few days, and I shot some comparison footage of different stuff, and I haven't looked at it until now. But let's try and figure out which might be the best camera for me. And first up, we're gonna look at just the image, 4K versus 8K. So I just added contrast and saturation, tried to match them as closely as possible. Judging by the vector scope and waveform, they're matching pretty well. And at first glance, it feels like they look very, very similar in terms of like quality, just image quality. I'm not looking at really the colors right now, just image quality. But I will say that the Canon R5 looks a little bit more detailed to me. The Sony looks like it has detail and sharpness, but it kind of looks like it has a little bit less detail and then just added a little bit more sharpness to it. Whereas the EOS R5, I gotta say, the image looks really, really nice. So just in terms of image quality, I think the R5 wins this one, in 8K at least, which has its own problems. I kind of wish I had this comparison in 4K HQ and the normal 4K, but judging from all my experience so far, the 4K HQ and the 8K look very, very similar. So yeah, I gotta give this one to the Canon. Then let's look at color science. I made a pretty controversial statement saying that I think Sony colors might be better than Canon colors. But at that point, I hadn't done a side-by-side comparison, and now looking at this, I'm kind of going back and forth. On this studio setup, I feel like Canon's colors are a lot more natural, a lot nicer. The Sony's colors, the skin tones are a little bit green, not quite as nice. But then when I go to this shot of Tyler, it's still the same thing. I think the Canon is more accurately portraying what Tyler looks like here, whereas the Sony looks a little bit green. But I think I prefer the Sony look here. I think it's like a little bit more cinematic to me, even though it's not as accurate to the real world scenario. So maybe the Canon colors are a little bit more natural, more accurate, and the Sony colors are a little bit more cinematic, I want to say. It might also be the dynamic range affecting how I'm looking at it, but I think that's my conclusion right now. Honestly, I don't know which way to go on this. I'd love to hear what you guys think. I would give Sony the win for the more cinematic image and Canon the win for more accurate colors, right now at least. I don't know which is best. I think it's starting to be a personal preference thing. Then let's look at the 120 frames per second. We all want to use the 120 frames per second, and I want to know which one looks better. And looking at it, I think the Sony looks a bit cleaner, a little bit sharper than the R5. But the Canon is more stable with the IBIS. I think that's doing a lot of work there. And the Sony, you have a tiny bit of a crop. Like, you really can't notice it, but there is a tiny bit of a crop. And the Sony, you do get sound. Canon, you're not going to get any sound. So that's a drawback for the Canon. And then also, we can't forget that on the Sony, you actually get 240 frames per second in 1080, which the Canon R5 definitely doesn't do. I think this one's a toss-up again. Both have their strengths, but I think I'm gonna have to give it to the Sony because of the 240 and the sound and a little bit cleaner, sharper, more detailed image. Again, I'd love to know what you guys think. Next up, stabilization. And I think Canon is way more stable. I think the IBIS is putting in the work here. Of course, we might get some of those wobbles at certain times. But once we get on the active stabilization on the Sony a7S III, it's a lot more similar. They're a lot closer. The Sony does crop in a little bit because it is an electronic stabilization. Again, both are really good, but I think Canon wins stabilization in my opinion. I think the Canon with the IBIS, it's better IBIS, wins the stabilization category. And then autofocus. I've been waiting for this day. Look at this footage. Both are incredible. They're both doing so well. I was really trying to be tricky and doing all sorts of movements, and both of them were pretty much flawless. I would say they're both winners in autofocus. Sony has really caught up to Canon, although the Canon did go out of focus for just a little bit at the end. Now my tests weren't completely scientific, so it might have been that I went closer to the Canon than the Sony and that threw it off or something like that. But Sony didn't fail once in that situation. Maybe there's different situations where there's less detail or when there isn't a face to track. I feel like those situations Canon might be a tiny bit better still. But overall, I gotta say, this one's a tie for me. Dynamic range, very important, probably one of the most important thing. And I think this one's pretty clear. Sony wins this one. Even in S-Log2, we got more dynamic range than in the C-Log on the R5 and definitely in the S-Log3. But I think most of the time you're gonna be fine with the C-Log dynamic range. I think a lot of people are just gonna be perfectly fine with that. But Sony definitely wins the dynamic range hands down on this category. Now photos, I didn't get a ton of time to test this out, and I don't think either of the RAWs actually work in Lightroom right now, so you can't really test this one really well. But I think it's pretty safe to say the R5 is the better photo camera by a long shot. The image looks beautiful, even just in some of the little test shots that I took. And if you need to blow it up and do a massive print, you're gonna be able to do that with the R5. The Sony a7S III, you are not gonna be able to do that with 12 megapixels. But most people nowadays are using photos for Instagram, social media, and for those, the 12 megapixels is gonna be just fine. It's not gonna be a big deal at all. You're not gonna need more megapixels. But in terms of photography, hands down, the R5 wins this category. Low light, I didn't get a chance to do a side-by-side, but I did test them separately, and it's safe to say that the Sony a7S III is the low light king still. It is much better in low light. But the R5 is no slouch. It's really good in low light also. No problems going up to 12,800 in my opinion. I was pretty impressed with how good the R5 was. But Sony a7S III wins the low light category. Then let's talk about overheating, because it doesn't matter how fancy the specs and everything are. If it overheats and doesn't work and you can't use it, doesn't really matter much. Now, for me, in all of the tests that I did, I never had the Sony a7S III overheat at all. Not even a bit, even after hours of shooting with Daniel Schiffer. Now, he was doing shorter bursts of 120 and 240, but I didn't have any overheating. I was filming longer clips in 120 frames per second and 240, which is kind of absurd that you can just let the 240 frames per second roll as long as you want. No bursts, no having to write to the card. Just as long as you want. Insane. No overheating for me on the Sony a7S III, but I have seen online some people were able to make it overheat, and I think one guy even had a test between the two and had the Sony overheat faster than the R5. Seems really weird to me, just in the fact that I use both cameras very similarly, doing B-roll and all that stuff, and the R5 definitely overheated, and the Sony a7S III did not overheat once for me. So in terms of overheating, I think Sony is the winner here with less overheating, just to be clear. And lastly, in terms of editing, both cameras are kind of a nightmare right now. Neither worked very well. I would say that the R5 is a little bit worse, especially if you're trying to edit 8K footage, but neither are good. I think this is a tie for just both being kind of crappy to edit with. It is just chugging along. You might need to do proxies or convert to ProRes or something like that to edit a little bit more smoothly and just save your sanity. And lastly, for me, I wish I had both cameras here. Something that's really important for me is the size of the whole setup, especially for YouTube and vlogging and all that. And here, hands down, the Sony wins. The whole package is so much smaller, especially with the with the new Sony microphone. This is a Rode VideoMic Pro Plus. This is the new electronic Sony microphone, and this is with the windsock. This doesn't even have the windsock on. This is a massive, massive difference in size. Some people want a bigger camera. For me, I would rather have a little bit smaller of a camera. Just looking at this, the whole thing looks a little bit daunting. So for me, the Sony wins this category. And there's a bunch of other different categories like the dual card slots and that kind of stuff that we could look at. But for me, none of those are as important. And also both now have flip LCD screens. I will say that the Canon's flip LCD screen I think is a little bit better because it's a little bit bigger, a little bit more clear, but both have it now, so that's really great. So there we are, Sony a7S III versus Canon R5, and when we tally up to see who the winner is, or for me possibly, we have ties 3, Canon had 3 winners, and Sony had 5 categories of winners, which is pretty interesting. I thought it was going to be a lot more in favor of the Sony, but as we can see here, both cameras really have their strengths. I don't think definitely neither camera is a bad camera. Both cameras are incredible cameras. It just depends on what you're looking for in the end, I think. That's really gonna make the difference for you. For example, for me, photos aren't as big of a thing, so I could even take that whole category out of there, and then Canon would only have 2 and Sony would have 5. But I'm curious, what did you guys think? Did you guys score any differently than I did? I want to know it all in the comments. Also, I don't know, did you guys notice this wall is looking a bit different now? Big day in the office today. We are painting this whole thing black, full on black. Chris here is the mastermind behind the painting. You would not want me to paint it. It would look horrendous if I tried to paint this wall. Thank you, Becky. Becky's been helping me. I've been sending Becky and Chris, if you don't know, they're amazing YouTubers. Becky's been helping me. I've been sending her pictures and asking, like, what should I do? I don't know. I'm terrible at, like, interior design. And Becky's like, full black. gave me like the paint code and everything. Thank you, Becky. I really, really appreciate it. Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate it. If you need painter help in Toronto, Chris here is your man. Hot dang, it looks so much better now. Good work, Chris. I could not have done this. I feel like I have a completely brand new wall to film on now. This is incredible. Now we just need the neon sign right there.
It's chalkboard paint, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Equations on that?
For sure.
Yeah.
It's funny, I used to think that this wall was really nice because it's so dark, and now, because the walls are black, this looks too bright, and I feel like we just gotta paint this thing black too. Next thing you know, it's just gonna continue and continue. It's gonna be black everywhere because it just looks so dang good. I'm pumped on that one. The office is finally coming together, very happy, but I am a little bit sad because I don't want to use the R5 anymore. All right, see you guys.